I'm Tyrus.
I'm Liz Clayman.
I'm Greg Jarrett, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, May 21st, 2021. I'm Chris Foster. Turning the corner on coronavirus.
I don't have a real good picture for what the future looks like for every industry. But I know Jamie Dimon's a really smart guy from J.P. Morgan. And 2 weeks ago, he told the Wall Street Journal that he believes by October, everything will look normal. Everything will be normal. It will be as if it never happened.
We speak with Fox News Channel host Bill Hemmer.
I'm Lisa Brady. Each side of the aisle in Washington is under pressure from within their own party. Or are they?
The reality is that a party that is pretty aligned with Donald Trump is a party that's pretty aligned with where Republican voters were at.
When we look at the numbers in terms of Democrats critical of President Biden, which would indicate a split on the left that the media should be attending to, it's just not there.
And I'm Joe Concha. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
More people are in control of protecting themselves and other unvaccinated people from coronavirus now. 27 states never put mask mandates in place, but 14 states with them announced that they'd be relaxed immediately or within a few weeks, when guidance from the Centers for Disease Control came out that fully vaccinated people were mostly safe to go maskless. One of those states, New York, dropped its mask mandate on Wednesday. New York City was one of the first and hardest hit cities during the early days of the pandemic. There have been more than 33,000 coronavirus deaths reported there. Businesses had been closed and limited in capacity. Those restrictions are now lifted, and the city's buzzing again, just not quite as loudly as before yet.
There's a new vibe in the city. I think traffic has returned.
Bill Hemmer hosts America's Newsroom weekday mornings on Fox News Channel.
Not fully, but it feels like New York again. I think the neighborhoods are actually quite advanced. I think Midtown lags, and that will be a lagging indicator for a long time, I think, because there's so many skyscrapers here that have empty tenant space. And I don't know what these companies are going to do when they bring people back. And every company, it seems, is a little different from the other. So that's going to take some time.
You've been working in the office. I have not. Like you mentioned, work could be, or you alluded to at least, work could be different for a lot of people who are seeing the benefits of maybe not spending so much time commuting, or choice and flexibility about where they live. I wonder how much of that sticks. I guess it'll be industry by industry.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a real good picture for what the future looks like for every industry. But I know Jamie Dimon's a really smart guy from J.P. Morgan. And 2 weeks ago, he told the Wall Street Journal that he believes by October, everything will look normal. Everything will be normal. It will be as if it never happened. That is an extraordinary statement. I don't know if he's right, but that's where his head is today.
Well, it sounds fair. I mean, not to keep this conversation completely New York City centric, but by then, Broadway shows will have been the last thing really to be open fully. So maybe in October, maybe that's it. Maybe
could be.
Maybe things have just snapped.
It could be. California. Look, New York was pretty much behind a lot of different states across the country, and now California is behind New York. California is not going to get rid of the mask at least until we get into the month of June, as of today, based on their guidance. With respect to Broadway could be open today based on the guidelines, but the production is going to take some time to get up to speed. Hence the reason why it's going to be September or October before the theater district opens. And I tell you, if you came to New York right now and you drove around the theater district, it is an absolute ghost town. I mean, restaurant after restaurant and bar after bar and hotel after hotel and theater after block after block. There's been nothing moving there. Now it's starting to change. It's starting to come out of their shell. But that will be, I guess that will be the last leg to fall with regard to New York.
Were you surprised at how quickly things changed after the CDC guidance on masks changed last week? Even states like New York that had been taking the pandemic very seriously from early on immediately said, okay, that's it. If you've been vaccinated, we're going to follow this guidance now, and the masks can mostly go if you're vaccinated. I was shocked at how quickly it happened in some of these states.
It was like they flipped a switch. You know, you went to bed on Monday and you woke up on Tuesday in a different place. You know, I went to Florida about 2 months ago, spent 10 days down there, and no one was wearing masks. The restaurants were packed, and I was fine with all of that. So much of the lifestyle is outdoors. There was no social distancing. I was okay. Florida did it differently, and It gave me a reminder of everything that we have given up. And I am so happy that so many of us can get part of that back now, if not all of it very soon.
There's still quite a bit of vaccine hesitancy, more than I thought. I thought there would be initially, and then when people saw, hey, it seems to be working, people aren't dropping dead in the street from the vaccine. But some people say, nope, I'm never, ever, ever going to get it. But I guess we're going to reach the point where, okay, it's your personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a personal decision. I do agree with the last point on that. I was one of those who was like, I'm not necessarily jumping in the line first here to get the shots. Two things changed my mind. I watched how it was rolled out late December into January. And then there's a doctor who works at Fox, Dr. Mark Siegel, and he's been studying pandemics for 20 years. He's written books on it, fiction and nonfiction alike. He's written books of fiction about pandemics that never happened. It's just stuff he pulled out of his own brain. So I've relied on his counsel a lot during the last 15 months or so. And he's convinced that it's the single greatest vaccine that humankind has ever created, and it's the safest. And with regard to efficacy, I haven't had a flu shot in 20 years, but I never stopped to think about how effective a flu shot was before, and now I understand it's between 30 and 60%. Well, these are well above 90%, which is just phenomenal. It's the best, most effective vaccine that humankind has ever made. The second thing that convinced me is that I do believe over the next year, if you're going to want to travel out of this country, you're going to have to prove that you got the jabs. And therefore, you're going to have the card that's legitimate, that shows that you have been fully vaccinated. And because of those two reasons, I went to the hospital sooner than I would have thought, and I haven't regretted it.
There's a dispute over mask rules in the House chamber. Republicans are saying they should be dropped due to these CDC guidelines. However, we do not know exactly who among these Republicans have been vaccinated. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says, nope, the rules stay until everybody's vaccinated, which of course could mean forever. So to the very end of this, masks are still a political symbol.
A couple of things run through my mind. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Not everybody's vaccinated here. I think 75% of the Republicans in the House have said they've gotten the shot, which leaves you 25%. But medical experts, and I think the CDC would say that's still okay. Especially for those who have been vaccinated, you're going to be safe and clean. The effect of that is that she's already fined 4 members of the Republican Party $500, comes right out of their paycheck. And they've given warnings as of today, I believe, to 8 others. If you get a second fine, that goes up to $2,500. And we spoke with a woman from Iowa. She's a member of the Republican delegation, and she said, listen, I'm a doctor too. I've studied this stuff. I'm okay. We should not have a mask mandate on the floor of the House. And she insists that she's not going to put it back on, even though she has already paid her $500. Well, let's wait and see what happens when that goes to $2,500. Who else is slapped with that, and what happens as a result? But even here in New York, there was, some major companies that, ours included, that pretty much said as of May 20th that we were going to be okay in our office spaces to not wear a mask. So yet again, another layer that is peeling away. I'm not quite sure where the debate ends up in Congress, but there's clearly a level of disagreement as of now.
I was reading a study that I thought was at least interesting. I don't know exactly what it says about us, but this poll in the United Kingdom where there have been people throughout the pandemic that are reluctant to wear a mask. They don't want to do it. But there's zero correlation to their political party at all. It doesn't matter who they vote for or, conservative, liberal. It's just even across the board, the percentage of people who say they don't want to wear a mask. We here are more into our team than they may be in the United Kingdom.
That's very interesting. Your observation may be pretty accurate. I wore mine to keep myself safe and to keep my family safe and my colleagues, and I did it to be a good and cooperating citizen. I can understand perhaps there are political differences, but in what they are rooted, I do not know, other than to say that government cannot tell me what to do. I will say this: I've been to a lot of communist countries growing up and through a lot of my own personal travel and professional travel during my life, Soviet Union, Cuba, a few others, Eastern Europe. And you can see during the pandemic when the government tells you something to do day after day, week after week, and then month after month, that went into more than a year of commands and demands, how beaten down you can get because your behavior changes and you adapt and you say, I got to do it. Okay, I'll do it. Well, imagine what would happen if a communist government told their citizens what to do not month after year over year, decade over decade. You would find yourself to be subservient to the state. And I've seen that play out in a way that I think shows us a little bit about how that history had developed over time in some of the countries I just mentioned.
We talked last time, a few months ago, about getting back to taking trips. You mentioned you went to Florida. I've been to Florida myself through this a few months ago. My only trip during the pandemic, my only time on a plane during the pandemic. It was weird. I still haven't been back to a restaurant inside maskless yet. Have you? How did it feel? Was it strange?
Wow. Great question. You haven't been on a plane?
I have been on one plane. I actually took a train to Florida and a plane back.
Wow. Must have been a heck of a train ride. So lovely there in the Southeast. I flew a lot during COVID. I felt very good about it. I'm a Delta diva, so I always fly Delta. I thought they were very good about keeping middle seats open and not packing the plane. They do require you to wear the mask. I was okay with that. Sometimes I wore two just to be safe because I'm not quite sure what was floating around that the inside of that cabin. But I was comfortable with it. Our team, and we've been waiting to do this, not everybody, but we grabbed a few folks and were able to head out to a local restaurant here in Midtown, middle of the day. And we all sat around a table. Nobody wore a mask and nobody thought twice about it. And to me, that's a really good sign about normalcy coming back to a lot of people's lives.
Bill Hemmer, co-host America's Newsroom Mornings on Fox News Channel with Dana Perino. How's Dana these days, by the way?
I really enjoy working with her. She brought Jasper to the set this week, so that was kind of exciting because we did a little show outside to show the reopening of New York. She's great. Love to work with her. Great attitude, positive all the time, and has a lot to say.
Bill, good to talk to you. Thanks.
You too. Thanks.
This is Joe Concha with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
Some of what happened in the U.S. House this week is emblematic of larger debates simmering in both parties. Two bills stemming from the deadly Capitol riot are heading to the U.S. Senate, but facing an uncertain fate after House debate that got emotional and political. A $1.9 billion measure to boost Capitol security passing by just one vote Thursday.
The funding will respond to the cost to harden the Capitol, to repair the Capitol, and then to harden against future attacks.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had several defections in her own party, mainly over broader concerns about policing. Republicans had concerns about the cost, and Washington Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler argued the bill should have included police leadership reform.
That's part of the problem here. That's part of the problem with this bill is we're putting the money there, but we're not reforming the system.
The bill includes security measures like retractable fencing and a rapid response force, also providing extra security for members of Congress in D.C. and at home, and for federal judges who've also faced threats as rioters are prosecuted. A bill that would create an independent commission to study the Capitol breach won more bipartisan support, over 30 Republicans joining Democrats to back it. But the House and Senate minority leaders did not, criticizing the process and calling it a political commission. Democrats accused them of politicizing it and of caving to former President Trump, who calls the commission a Democrat trap.
I think Republicans have an opportunity to try to make the case that they would like to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th.
Kristen Soltis Anderson is a Republican pollster and Fox News contributor.
And, for many Republicans, those who have said, look, I think this has been spun out of proportion by the media, et cetera. In my view, this commission would be a perfect way to get real facts out there, to have Republican voices at the table in the fact-finding process. And so, I think that's part of why you saw 35 Republicans sort of break with leadership and decide to vote for the commission.
I mean, the former president, came out pretty swiftly, released a statement knocking those 35 House Republicans who voted in favor of the commission. Do Republicans take a risk by challenging him?
Certainly, for any Republican that sort of takes a step that President Trump doesn't like, there is always the risk of backlash, because by and large, Republicans are pretty unified in saying either that they believe Donald Trump should be the leader of the party, or by saying, even if they don't think Donald Trump should be the leader of the party, that they nonetheless still like him. That there's not a ton of appetite in the party for disagreement, breaking with party leadership. What's kind of fascinating is that at one point in time, about 10 years ago, with the rise of the Tea Party, you had the grassroots really in a position of saying, look, we want our members, we don't care about party unity. We want folks to stand on principle. And now it's almost as though that's shifted a little bit, where some of those very same folks would say, no, right now the most important thing for fighting Democrats is staying unified rather than being distracted. And in some ways, it's the more moderate members who are the ones saying, no, I don't want to just go along with party unity. I'm the one that's going to try to stand up on my own principles. The dynamic has shifted quite a bit over the last decade.
The 2022 midterms feel closer all the time from a political standpoint somehow. How much of the GOP infighting is just media hype, though? Is it something that the media is really playing up more than reality?
Yeah, I think in general, if I go do a survey of Republican voters, while there is going to be, maybe 1 in 6 who say, I really don't like President Trump and I really don't like the direction of the party, that's a pretty small portion. And I think, ultimately, if you turn on, the mainstream news, that 1/6 of the party gets about 50% of the coverage. So, it's certainly a presence within the party, but most of the party is pretty unified behind the idea that they liked the job President Trump had done, they wish he had won the election, and they're looking for Republicans to be unified moving forward. So I think sometimes the GOP civil war, while there is real disagreement within even, party voters about how the party should be thinking about, say, the role of President Trump moving forward, I think that disagreement gets really amplified in the coverage, and the percentage of Republicans who want to go a different direction kind of get overrepresented in the coverage.
One of the frequent Republican arguments is Democrat hypocrisy, and they point to things like President Biden canceling the Keystone Pipeline, but then not trying to block a Russian pipeline to Germany. Is that gaining traction with voters beyond the Republican base?
Well, at the moment, Joe Biden and his administration, I would call their poll ratings fine. They're not great. At the moment, a lot of voters have simply just tuned out of politics. You've seen things like the very low ratings that Biden's address to the joint session of Congress got, fairly low ratings compared to both former Presidents Trump and Obama. People have just kind of tuned it out. So I think stories like this, for your true swing voter, we're too far out from the midterms for them to have tuned in. But the downside for Democrats is that Republicans still remain pretty tuned in and fired up, pretty engaged. Fundraising is really high for Republican groups, where for Democrats, it's as though they won in 2020 and are now resting on their laurels a little bit. They're not terribly fired up by what's going on in Washington. And I think with President Trump taking a little bit less of the national spotlight, they've sort of become much more content.
The House Speaker says Republicans need to take back their party. Is it possible for Republicans to unify as long as the former president is in the mix?
I think the idea of taking back their party, Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, and it wasn't just, I think at the time there was a sense, maybe it was a kind of a blip that, it was like a perfect storm of things that enabled him to rise. But Republicans, by and large, liked the tenure that Trump had in office. They liked that 4 years. They wanted 4 more years of it. He won an unbelievably high percentage of Republicans in the presidential election. So the idea of trying to take their party back, the reality is that a party that is pretty aligned with Donald Trump is a party that's pretty aligned with where Republican voters were at. The bigger challenge for Republicans is, to what extent is that going to have appeal with swing voters in the election? And that's why I think you're going to see them sort of understanding that Trump is a little less popular among swing voters, but the Democratic agenda they can really go after and say, here's what we want to be a check and balance against. I expect you'll see that become more of the message coming out of Republicans when they begin talking more and more to swing voters in the months to come.
Democrats have had some infighting, too, including over the recent fighting between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza. President Biden facing progressive pressure to support Palestinian citizens more after expressing support for Israel's right to defend itself.
Well, I think that it creates a dilemma for President Biden.
Juan Williams is a Democratic strategist and co-host of The Five on Fox News Channel.
Clearly, the United States is an ally of Israel and a longstanding friend. But I think that what we're experiencing is a big change in terms of public attitudes in the United States towards Israel. This is the first time that I can remember that Israel's involved in a conflict in the age of social media. So a lot of voices are being heard who might have been ignored before. And right now, you also have the political overlay that Prime Minister Netanyahu had a very close relationship with President Trump. He relies on several key Republican donors. He did not have a good relationship with President Obama, even came to speak to the Congress at the invitation of Republicans, not the president. That was unprecedented at the time. And so I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is unaware of how the politics now is starting to color America's love for Israel, and I don't think he anticipated that there could be such a strong sense that, Israel is the stronger hand here as compared to the Palestinians. And you would even have Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, a Jewish American, suggesting that the United States withhold arms sales to Israel.
What about the left on other issues? And I ask because, moderate Democrats lost seats in the 2020 election, but now we've had some progressives say they've been pleasantly surprised by the way that this president has governed so far. If he's behaving more progressively than some expected, could that hurt Democrats in the 2022 midterms?
Well, I think that's the Republican critique. You don't have to go too far to hear a Republican say that the Democrats are overrun with socialists and that Joe Biden and his effort in terms of the relief package for the pandemic and now the infrastructure deal, that this is introducing socialism to America. So I think that's the standard Republican critique. So far, we don't see it in the poll numbers. What we see, in fact, is support, not only for Biden, his approval rating's pretty high, but support for the infrastructure spending plan, which is, of course, in the trillions of dollars. It's unbelievable.
What if he's able to find common ground with Republicans on a bipartisan infrastructure deal? Would he then pay a price and lose support with progressives?
This is a two-part question, actually, because one of the ideas being put forward, notably by Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, is that you could divide the infrastructure bill into two parts, and you could get bipartisan Republican and Democratic support for that first part, and then the president might, go after a second infrastructure bill with things that he doesn't have bipartisan support for. That might include, for example, child care. Is that infrastructure? Biden says it is. It's necessary for women to get to work. But many Republicans say they want steel and concrete and, tar on their infrastructure products. So it's possible that he gets bipartisan support for the first part of this deal, Lisa, and not for the second. And that's the way they're looking at it right now.
Is there a chance that the media, which sometimes gets criticism from both sides of the aisle, would rather focus on the problems in the Republican Party than the problems President Biden could face within his own party? Do you see any, unbalance, any disparity there?
Right now, I think there's a lot of criticism of the media coming from the right. They see the media, along with Hollywood as the elites and all that. But when we look at the numbers in terms of Democrats critical of President Biden, which would indicate a split on the left that the media should be attending to, it's just not there. Biden has I think it's more than 90% support among Democrats in the country. So he's doing pretty well there at the moment. The argument from the right is that some on the left have quieted their criticism of Biden in order to have a Democratic president. Now, from on the right, you clearly have a civil war going on in terms of President Trump versus Liz Cheney, the congresswoman from Wyoming, and it's pretty much out in the open, given that Cheney lost her leadership spot in the House Republican caucus, and President Trump is out there making it very clear he doesn't like Liz Cheney and he doesn't like anybody who's challenging him. So one is, kind of up in the air for all to see, and the other, for the moment, is there, but it's not as visible because Democrats are maintaining a united front.
Juan Williams, so nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Lisa.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and four-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
A California teen is sweetening the lives of others, one bite at a time. Vedika Jawa was just 15 years old when her family trip to San Francisco planted a seed in her mind that's grown into a mission. The Associated Press reports that when she saw people living on the streets during that trip, she returned to her home in Fremont, California, and decided to do something to help them. She reached out to homeless shelters and offered to bake treats for the residents. Some of the people in charge told her she was too young. Others just ignored her. But she persisted. She started with a neighborhood bake sale and collected ingredients at her school, then finally got a shelter to allow her to bake for the people who were staying there. It was the beginning of her student-run nonprofit called Bake for Sake, which distributes desserts to those in need. Over the last year and a half, the project has gone from a handful of friends who helped out with the baking in her hometown to more than 100 volunteers who now work with 15 homeless shelters in 10 locations nationwide. The Bake for Sake Instagram page says the project has now served more than 17,000 desserts to the homeless community. Vedika says she hopes to see it grow even more, with people opening their own Bake for Sake chapters, especially during this time of illness, job loss, and business closures that have created greater food insecurity. She says, quote, "We think that a simple act of kindness can go a long way for someone who is facing such a difficult time." Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Concha.
What's on your mind?
If you watch ABC, CBS, NBC, or CNN, you likely have been bombarded over the last month about a Republican civil war. Starring Liz Cheney, the media it girl that everyone is making out to be the next Wonder Woman, bravely taking on the powerful in her own party. In a non-stop campaign to stop the 45th president, who, by the way, isn't in office, instead of focusing on the current occupant in Joe Biden. But we're not talking about this civil war. We're talking about the one on the Democratic side that you're not hearing about over the president's handling or non-handling of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib confronted Joe Biden on a Michigan tarmac recently over it, particularly around support for Israel. How dare he? This comes after Congresswoman and Mideast policy expert Alexander.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.